George Strait's maid is humiliated for speaking 9 different languages. The crystal chandelier trembled slightly as Elena Vasquez polished each delicate piece, her weathered hands moving with the precision of someone who understood that perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. At 42 years old, she had learned that in the sprawling mansion of country music legend George Strait, every surface told a story, and tonight, those stories would witness something that would change her life forever. What Eleanor didn't know, as she prepared for the most important evening of her career, was that within hours she would become the center of a humiliation so devastating that it would echo through the halls of country music history. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the San Antonio mansion, casting golden rays across the impeccable marble floors that Elena had spent 3 years perfecting. Each day began the same way. At 5:30 in the morning, she would arrive at the servants' entrance, change into her crisp uniform, and begin the meticulous process of maintaining what many considered the crown jewel of Texas country estates. The mansion sprawled across 15,000 square feet, with rooms that showcased George Strait's legendary career through platinum albums, awards, and photographs with presidents and celebrities. But for Elena, these walls held different memories, silent conversations in languages that no one suspected she could speak, and dreams that she kept locked away like precious secrets. Elena moved through the master bedroom with practiced efficiency, her eyes automatically scanning for anything out of place. The king-sized bed with its hand-carved headboard was already made to military precision, the Egyptian cotton sheets crisp and inviting. She paused at the nightstand, where a photograph of George Strait with his family caught the morning light. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine her own daughter, Sophia, standing in a similar photograph someday. Successful, respected, surrounded by the opportunities that Elena had sacrificed everything to provide. The dream felt both impossibly distant and tantalizingly close, especially today, when the bonus that George had promised could finally make Sophia's university dreams a reality. As she dusted the mahogany dresser, Elena's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced around quickly before answering in fluent Portuguese to her friend Maria, who was calling from Brazil about a translation opportunity. "Não posso agora, Maria. Estou trabalhando," she whispered, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone completely comfortable in multiple linguistic worlds. She had learned long ago to keep these conversations brief and private. Her linguistic abilities were a secret she guarded more carefully than any treasure. In her experience, being overqualified was often more dangerous than being underqualified, especially for someone in her position. The irony wasn't lost on her as she moved to the library, a room lined with first-edition books and volumes on Texas history. Elena ran her fingers along the spines, remembering when she used to own a library nearly as impressive, filled with dictionaries, linguistics textbooks, and literature from around the world. That was before the economic crisis that had shattered her consulting business, before she had lost everything and found herself starting over in a new country with nothing but her determination and a resume that seemed to belong to someone else's life. Now these books belonged to someone else, and she was paid to keep them dust-free rather than to read them. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're joining us from. Your support means everything to us as we share these incredible stories of triumph and transformation. Now, back to Elena's extraordinary journey. Eleanor descended the grand staircase, her hand gliding along the polished banister as she mentally reviewed the day's tasks. The evening's dinner party would be the most important event the mansion had hosted in years. George Strait was celebrating his latest album reaching #1, a remarkable achievement that had surprised even his most devoted fans and industry insiders. The guest list read like a who's who of the music industry, producers who had shaped the sound of modern country, executives whose decisions could make or break careers, and investors whose influence extended far beyond Nashville. In the kitchen, Elena began preparing for the catering staff's arrival. She had worked with this team before, and they knew to expect her silent efficiency and attention to detail. What they didn't know was that she understood every word of their conversations, whether they spoke in English, Spanish, or the occasional French phrase that the head chef liked to use when he thought no one was listening. She had become an expert at appearing invisible while absorbing everything around her, a skill that had served her well in her previous life as an international interpreter and continued to protect her now. The kitchen phone rang, and Elena answered with her usual professional tone. "Strait residence, Elena speaking." The voice on the other end spoke rapid Italian, clearly having dialed the wrong number, but before she could stop herself, Elena responded fluently, "Mi dispiace, ma penso che abbia sbagliato numero." She caught herself immediately, glancing around to ensure no one had overheard, and quickly ended the call. These moments happened more often than she cared to admit, her brain automatically processing and responding in whatever language was being spoken to her, a reflex built over decades of professional interpreting that she couldn't seem to turn off. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Eleanor found herself in George Strait's home office, carefully dusting the awards and memorabilia that chronicled one of country music's most storied careers. The room always made her slightly emotional, not because of the fame it represented, but because of the dedication and perseverance it symbolized. George Strait had built his empire through consistent excellence, never chasing trends, but staying true to his authentic voice. Elena understood that kind of determination, that commitment to excellence even when no one was watching. She paused at his desk, where sheet music for his new Spanish-language songs lay scattered across the mahogany surface. Eleanor's heart clenched as she read the lyrics, beautiful, heartfelt words about family, sacrifice, and the immigrant experience, but translated with the stilted formality of someone who didn't truly understand the emotional nuances of the language. She longed to offer suggestions, to help him capture the poetry that would make these songs resonate with Spanish-speaking audiences, but she knew her place. She was there to clean, not to critique or collaborate. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when the first delivery trucks arrived. Flowers from the most exclusive florist in San Antonio, cases of vintage wine, and tables and chairs that would transform the mansion's grand ballroom into an intimate dining space fit for royalty. Elena coordinated with the various vendors with quiet authority, her organizational skills evident to anyone paying attention. She had managed international conferences with heads of state, but now she applied those same skills to ensuring that napkins were properly folded and place settings were precisely aligned. As evening approached, Eleanor retreated to the small staff bathroom to change into her serving uniform, a crisp black dress with white apron that made her look like every other invisible member of the service staff. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who had learned to make herself small, unnoticed, forgettable, but behind her eyes lived someone else entirely. A woman who had once commanded rooms full of diplomats, who had facilitated conversations that shaped international policy, who had been respected and valued for her mind rather than her ability to remain unseen. The first guests began arriving at 7 o'clock sharp, their laughter and conversation filling the mansion with an energy that Elena had rarely experienced during her quiet days of solitary work. She moved among them like a ghost, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, her presence acknowledged only when someone needed something. She listened to their conversations about the music industry, about international markets and expansion opportunities, understanding far more than anyone suspected about the complex business discussions happening around her. It was during the main course that Elena's carefully constructed invisibility began to crack. A distinguished gentleman with a French accent was discussing the challenges of marketing country music in Europe when he knocked over his wine glass, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. Without thinking, Elena immediately responded in perfect French, "Ne vous inquiétez pas, monsieur, je vais nettoyer cela tout de suite." The man looked up in surprise, his eyes widening as he processed that the woman he had barely noticed had just spoken to him in flawless Parisian French. The conversation at the nearby tables quieted slightly as other guests began to take notice. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized her mistake, but before she could retreat, a Russian investor called out to her in his native tongue, asking where he might find the restroom. Again, without conscious thought, Eleanor responded fluently in Russian, giving him detailed directions. The businessman's eyebrows shot up in amazement, and he began chatting with her animatedly about Moscow, clearly delighted to find someone who understood not just his language, but the cultural references he was making. Word began to spread through the dining room like wildfire. The quiet woman who had been serving them all evening apparently spoke multiple languages fluently, A Chinese investor tested her with a complex question in Mandarin about the mansion's architecture, and Elena found herself drawn into a detailed discussion about the building's design influences and construction materials. Her responses were so sophisticated and knowledgeable that several guests stopped their own conversations to listen. Elena realized too late that she had become the center of attention, exactly what she had spent 3 years trying to avoid. Her heart pounded as she felt dozens of eyes upon her, some curious, others skeptical, and a few clearly calculating what this revelation might mean. She had worked so hard to remain invisible, to be trusted with her position precisely because she posed no threat to anyone's ego or sense of superiority. Now, in the span of 20 minutes, she had exposed herself as someone far more complex and capable than her role suggested. The situation might have remained a curious footnote to an otherwise successful evening, but Elena's growing visibility had caught the attention of Bryce Wellington, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his influence in the music industry. Bryce was the kind of person who viewed kindness as weakness and saw every interaction as an opportunity to establish dominance. He had built his career by making others feel small, and Elena's unexpected multilingual display presented an irresistible target for his particular brand of humiliation. As Elena tried to retreat back into invisibility, focusing intently on her serving duties and avoiding eye contact with the increasingly curious guests, she had no idea that across the room, George Strait himself had witnessed the entire exchange. The country legend stood in the doorway of his own dining room, having stepped away from a conversation about his upcoming tour to observe the unusual commotion. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Elena with an intensity that would have surprised her had she noticed it. What Elena couldn't have known was that George Strait had been watching her far longer than just this evening. For months he had noticed small details about his quiet employee, the different languages she spoke during her brief phone calls, the way she occasionally hummed melodies that seemed to come from various musical traditions around the world, and most tellingly, the advanced linguistics textbook she sometimes carried in her worn canvas bag. George Strait was a man who had spent decades reading people, understanding the stories they carried beneath their surface presentations, and Elena Vasquez had been an intriguing mystery that he was only now beginning to understand. As the evening progressed and Elena's linguistic abilities became the source of whispered conversations throughout the dining room, she found herself caught between two impossible choices: retreat completely and risk appearing rude to the guests who were now trying to engage her in conversation, or continue responding naturally and risk further exposure. She chose a middle path, answering politely but briefly, trying to demonstrate respect for the guests while not encouraging extended interactions. But Bryce Wellington was just getting started, and Elena was about to discover that sometimes being exceptional can be more dangerous than being ordinary. Bryce Wellington had spent 30 years in the music industry, perfecting the art of psychological warfare disguised as social interaction. At 55, his silver hair was impeccably styled, his custom-tailored suit cost more than most people made in 6 months, and his smile could freeze blood in someone's veins. He commanded respect through fear, loyalty through manipulation, and success through the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to make him feel inadequate. Tonight, a humble housekeeping staff member had inadvertently committed the unforgivable sin of demonstrating intelligence that surpassed his own, and Bryce was about to remind everyone in the room exactly who held the power. Elena felt his gaze before she saw him approaching. There was something predatory in the way he moved through the crowd, his eyes locked on her with the focused intensity of a hunter who had identified his prey. She had encountered men like Bryce Wellington before, during her years as an international interpreter, powerful men who viewed every interaction as a contest that they must win regardless of the cost to others. Her instincts screamed at her to disappear into the kitchen, to find any excuse to remove herself from his approaching orbit, but she was trapped by the very professionalism that had kept her employed for 3 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bryce announced, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a blade through silk. He raised his crystal wine glass, the sound ringing clear and commanding as he tapped it with his platinum wedding ring. The dining room gradually quieted, all attention turning toward him as he stood beside Elena, his presence looming over her like a storm cloud. "I believe we have witnessed something truly extraordinary this evening, and I think it deserves proper recognition." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she held the serving tray. her knuckles white against the polished silver. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the curious stares of people who had never truly seen her before tonight, and were now trying to reconcile the quiet woman who had served them for years with the multilingual mystery they had just discovered. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she prayed silently that Bryce would simply acknowledge her abilities and move on, but the cruel gleam in his eyes told her that her prayers would go unanswered. "It seems," Bryce continued, his tone carrying the false warmth of a politician delivering devastating news with a smile, "that our humble cleaning lady has been hiding quite the secret from us. Not only does she dust our furniture and scrub our floors, but apparently she's also been moonlighting as some sort of linguistic genius. Who knew that such extraordinary talents could be found wielding a mop and bucket?" The laughter that followed was uncomfortable and sporadic, the kind of nervous chuckling that people produce when they sense cruelty but feel powerless to stop it. Elena's cheeks burned with shame as she realized that her years of careful invisibility had been shattered in a single evening, replaced by a spotlight that felt more like an interrogation lamp. She wanted to explain, to tell them about her previous life, about the circumstances that had brought her to this point, but she knew that any words she spoke would only provide more ammunition for Bryce's attack. "I have to admit," Bryce said, beginning to pace around Elena like a prosecutor addressing a jury, "I'm curious about this remarkable transformation. One day you're scrubbing toilets, and the next you're conducting international diplomacy over the dinner table. It's quite the career pivot, wouldn't you say?" His words dripped with sarcasm, each syllable carefully crafted to strip away her dignity piece by piece. "Perhaps you could enlighten us about your educational background. Did you learn Mandarin while mopping the floors? Pick up Russian during your bathroom cleaning duties?" Elena forced herself to maintain eye contact with the floor, knowing that any response would only escalate the situation. She had learned during her years of economic struggle that sometimes survival meant swallowing pride, accepting humiliation as the price of keeping the job that fed her daughter and paid for Sophia's school supplies. But the silence that Bryce was demanding felt different from her usual invisibility. It was complicit, acknowledging his right to diminish her in front of others. "You know what I think?" Bryce announced, warming to his theme as he sensed Elena's vulnerability. "I think we're being played. I think our little polyglot here has been putting on quite the performance, pretending to understand languages she's probably picked up from television shows and Google Translate. It's easy to memorize a few phrases and fool people who aren't paying attention." He turned to address the room directly, his voice gaining momentum like a machine designed for destruction. "Have any of you actually tested her abilities? Or are we all just impressed because the help knows how to say hello in a few different languages?" The dining room had fallen completely silent now, the earlier conversations abandoned, as everyone watched the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of witnessing a car accident. Elena could feel tears threatening to spill from her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely, refusing to give Bryce the satisfaction of seeing her break. She thought of Sophia, studying late into the night for her entrance exams, dreaming of a future that depended entirely on Elena's ability to keep this job, no matter what humiliation it required her to endure. "Let's have a little test, shall we?" Bryce suggested, his tone now carrying the enthusiasm of a game show host about to reveal a cruel surprise. "Since you're apparently so gifted with languages, why don't you demonstrate for us? Give us a little recitation in each of your supposed 9 languages. Start with something challenging, maybe the Communist Manifesto in Russian, or perhaps some Dante in Italian, something that would prove you're not just a fraud with delusions of grandeur." Elena finally raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, the room held its breath. Those who knew her well enough to recognize the expression that crossed her face might have advised Bryce to stop, to retreat while he still could, because the woman looking back at him was not the submissive employee he thought he was humiliating. For just an instant, the international interpreter who had once mediated discussions between world leaders flickered to the surface, bringing with her the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove her worth to men like Bryce Wellington. But the moment passed, and Elena remembered where she was, who she was now, and what she stood to lose. She lowered her gaze again and spoke quietly, her voice barely audible above the silence. "I apologize if I have caused any confusion or disruption to your evening. It was not my intention to draw attention to myself or to make anyone uncomfortable. I will return to my duties in the kitchen." "Oh, how convenient," Bryce laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "The moment we ask for proof, our genius suddenly becomes shy. How very predictable. He turned to the other guests, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of theatrical disbelief. This is exactly what I was talking about. People today think they can claim anything, be anything, without ever having to back it up with actual substance. It's the participation trophy generation grown up. Everyone gets to be special, even if they're just making it all up. The other guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down at their plates, others glancing toward the doorway as if calculating their escape routes. The celebratory atmosphere of the evening had been completely poisoned by Bryce's assault, and even those who typically enjoyed his caustic wit were beginning to recognize that this had crossed a line from entertainment into cruelty. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Bryce continued, apparently oblivious to the growing discomfort of his audience. "It's the dishonesty, the pretense. This woman has been in our homes, around our families, our private conversations, and the whole time she's been playing some kind of elaborate con game. Who knows what she's really after? What she's been listening to and reporting back to whatever organization sent her here." Elena's head snapped up at this accusation, her eyes blazing with a fury that made several guests lean back in their chairs. The suggestion that she was some sort of spy or criminal was too much to bear in silence, even if speaking up cost her everything. "Sir," she said, her voice now carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in conference rooms around the world, "I have never betrayed the trust that Mr. Strait has placed in me. Every conversation I have overheard, every private moment I have witnessed in this house, has been kept in absolute confidence. I would never—" "There it is," Bryce exclaimed triumphantly, cutting her off mid-sentence. "There's the real voice, the educated accent she's been hiding behind that humble servant act. You see, I told you this was all performance. No one goes from speaking like a college professor to cleaning floors without there being something seriously wrong with the story." He leaned closer to Elena, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried clearly through the silent room. "What's your real game here, sweetheart? Industrial espionage, blackmail, or are you just another con artist looking for a rich mark to take advantage of?" The accusations hit Elena like physical blows, each word designed to destroy not just her reputation, but her very sense of self. She had spent 3 years building trust with the Strait family, proving her reliability and discretion, and now Bryce was systematically dismantling that foundation with nothing but speculation and malice. She could see the doubt creeping into the faces around her, the way people were now viewing her with suspicion rather than curiosity. "I think," Bryce announced, raising his voice to address the entire room, "that we should call security. Have this woman removed and investigated. If she's been lying about who she is, what else has she been lying about? What information has she gathered? What valuables might have gone missing?" He turned back to Eleanor with a smile that was pure venom. "Don't worry, though. I'm sure when they search your belongings, they'll find nothing more suspicious than some community college language textbooks and delusions of adequacy." The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs as guests began to process what they were witnessing. Some looked appalled by Bryce's behavior, others seemed uncertain about what to believe, and a few appeared to be enjoying the drama despite themselves. Elena stood frozen in the center of it all, clutching her serving tray like a shield, watching 3 years of careful work and reputation being destroyed by a man who had never bothered to learn her last name. But what no one in that room realized was that George Strait had been standing in the doorway for the past 10 minutes, listening to every word of Bryce Wellington's performance with an expression that would have terrified anyone who knew him well enough to recognize it. The king of country music was not known for dramatic displays of emotion, but those closest to him understood that his quietest moments often preceded his most decisive actions. And as he watched Elena Vasquez being systematically humiliated by a man he had never particularly liked, George Strait was making calculations that would change everyone's evening in ways they could never have anticipated. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point, with some guests beginning to push back from the table and others pulling out their phones to either record the confrontation or call for help. Eleanor stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, knowing that any move she made would either escalate the situation or confirm Bryce's accusations in the minds of those who were still undecided. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful interventions come from the quietest corners, and that true character is revealed not in moments of triumph, but in how we respond when we witness injustice being done to those who cannot defend themselves. The silence that followed was deafening. stretching across the dining room like a taut wire about to snap. Elena stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her hands gripping the silver serving tray so tightly that her knuckles had turned white against the polished metal. Around her, the most powerful people in country music sat in stunned stillness, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or persecution, entertainment or tragedy. The grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder than usual, marking each second of Eleanor's humiliation with mechanical precision. Then, cutting through the tension like a warm knife through butter, came a voice that every person in that room recognized instantly. "That's enough." The words were spoken quietly, without anger or theatrical emphasis, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. George Strait stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the entrance to his own dining room, his weathered face wearing an expression that his closest friends might have described as dangerous calm. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures or raised voices, but when George Strait spoke, people listened. And tonight, his words would change everything. Bryce Wellington turned toward the interruption with the confident smile of someone who assumed he was about to receive support for his performance. "George, perfect timing. We were just getting to the bottom of this little deception your employee has been running. I think you'll want to hear what we've discovered about—" "I said that's enough." George's voice hadn't risen in volume, but something in his tone made Bryce's words die in his throat. The country legend stepped into the room with the measured pace of a man who had spent decades commanding stages and boardrooms, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the entire space. Every eye turned toward him, and Elena felt a mixture of hope and terror as she realized that her fate was about to be decided by the one person in the room whose opinion truly mattered. George Strait walked directly to where Elena stood, his boots clicking against the marble floor with rhythmic precision. When he stopped beside her, he didn't look at Bryce or acknowledge the other guests. Instead, he turned his full attention to the woman who had been quietly serving his family for 3 years, his expression softening in a way that surprised everyone who witnessed it. "Elena," he said gently, "I think it's time we told these folks the truth about who you really are." Elena's eyes widened in shock as she realized that George Strait knew far more about her background than she had ever suspected. Her carefully guarded secrets, the professional life she had hidden away like buried treasure, somehow the most famous man in country music had discovered her truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she explain 3 years of deception, even if that deception had been born from necessity rather than malice? "You see," George continued, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, "Elena Vasquez isn't just any housekeeper. She's not even primarily a housekeeper, though she's certainly the best one I've ever employed." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Elena is one of the most accomplished international interpreters this country has ever produced. She spent 15 years facilitating conversations between heads of state, translating for the United Nations, and mediating international business negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The gasps that echoed through the dining room were audible, a collective intake of breath, as the assembled guests tried to process this revelation. Eleanor felt the floor shifting beneath her feet, not from any physical movement, but from the sudden realization that her carefully constructed new identity was crumbling away, replaced by the professional reputation she thought she had lost forever. "Elena speaks 9 languages fluently," George continued, his tone carrying the pride of someone announcing a beloved family member's achievements. "She holds advanced degrees in linguistics and international relations from prestigious universities. She has personally translated for 3 different presidents and has been instrumental in negotiating trade agreements that have shaped global commerce." He turned to look directly at Bryce Wellington, his eyes hardening. "She's also one of the most honest, hard-working and dignified people I've ever had the privilege to know." Bryce's face had gone through several color changes during George's speech, settling finally on a sickly pale that matched his increasingly desperate expression. "Well, that's very interesting, George, but it doesn't change the fact that she's been lying about who she is, pretending to be something she's not. You have to admit that's deceptive behavior that raises serious questions about her motives, and the only deceptive behavior I've witnessed tonight," George interrupted, his voice finally carrying an edge of steel that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats, "came from you, Bryce. Elena never lied about anything. She simply didn't volunteer information about her background because she needed this job, and she was afraid that being overqualified would cost her the opportunity to support her daughter. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Elena had never discussed her personal life with George, had never mentioned Sophia or her educational goals, yet somehow he knew about the most important driving force in her life. She stared at him in amazement, trying to understand how this quiet, reserved man had learned so much about her while she had worked so hard to remain invisible. "You want to know how I know all this?" George asked, as if reading Elena's thoughts. "Because I make it my business to know the people who work in my home, who have access to my family's private lives, who I trust with the things that matter most to me." He gestured toward Elena with something approaching reverence. "Elena has been giving me Spanish lessons for the past 6 months, not because I asked her to, but because she noticed I was struggling with pronunciation when I was working on some songs for my new album." The dining room erupted in surprised murmurs as guests processed this information. George Strait, the king of country music, taking language lessons from his housekeeper. The very idea challenged every assumption they had made about social hierarchies and professional relationships. "Every Tuesday and Thursday evening," George continued, "after her official duties were finished, Elena would stay an extra hour to help me understand not just the words, but the cultural context, the emotional nuances that would make my Spanish songs authentic rather than just translated." His voice softened with genuine gratitude. She never asked for extra pay, never mentioned it to anyone, never used it as an opportunity to push for advancement or special treatment. She simply saw someone struggling with something she could help with, and she offered her expertise quietly and generously. Eleanor felt tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had been fighting earlier. These were tears of recognition, of being truly seen and valued for who she was, rather than what others assumed her to be. For 3 years she had felt invisible, believing that her intelligence and experience were burdens to be hidden rather than gifts to be shared. "But here's what really tells you about Elena's character," George said, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his theme. "When I offered to pay her for these lessons, she refused. When I suggested that I could help her find a position more suited to her qualifications, she asked me not to. You know why?" He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many guests as possible before delivering his answer. "Because she didn't want anyone to think she was taking advantage of our working relationship. She valued the trust we had built more than she valued her own advancement." The contrast between Eleanor's integrity and Bryce's accusations couldn't have been starker, and everyone in the room understood it. Bryce Wellington, who had built his career on reading people and manipulating situations to his advantage, found himself completely outmaneuvered by a man he had underestimated and a woman he had dismissed entirely. "Now," George said, turning his attention back to Bryce with an expression that could have frozen hellfire, "let's talk about deception, shall we? Let's talk about a man who makes his living by tearing other people down, who thinks cruelty is clever and humiliation is humor. Let's talk about someone who just spent 20 minutes trying to destroy a woman's reputation and livelihood because her competence made him feel inadequate." Bryce opened his mouth to respond, but George wasn't finished. "You want to question someone's motives, Bryce? Let's question yours. You've been sitting in my home, eating my food, drinking my wine, and entertaining yourself by attacking an employee who has never done anything but serve you with professionalism and respect. What kind of man does that? What kind of character flaw drives someone to kick down at people who can't fight back?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the quiet of a judgment being rendered, of a moral line being drawn that everyone could see clearly. Elena watched in amazement as the most powerful man in the room used his influence not to protect his own interests or advance his own agenda, but to defend someone that the rest of the world saw as powerless. "Elena," George said, turning back to her with a smile that transformed his entire demeanor, "I have a proposition for you. My team has been struggling to coordinate the international aspects of my upcoming world tour. We need someone who can communicate with venues in multiple countries, work with local media, and help us connect authentically with fans who speak different languages." He paused, letting the implications of his words sink in. "The position pays significantly more than what you're earning now, includes health insurance and education benefits, and would involve travel to some of the most beautiful cities in the world. Are you interested?" Elena stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was offering. A few minutes ago, she had been facing the loss of her job and the destruction of her reputation. Now, the most successful country music artist of all time was offering her a position that would utilize all of her skills and provide the financial security she had been desperately seeking for her daughter's future. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Strait, I am honored beyond words, but I need to ask, why? Why would you do this for me?" George's smile broadened, and for the first time all evening, he looked completely relaxed. "Because, Elena, talent like yours shouldn't be hidden, experience like yours shouldn't be wasted, and character like yours deserves to be rewarded, not punished." He gestured toward the assembled guests. "These people here tonight, they're successful because someone saw their potential and gave them opportunities. Tonight, I'm seeing your potential, and I'm giving you an opportunity." The transformation in the room was palpable. Conversations began to bubble up as guests processed what they had witnessed, many of them approaching Elena to apologize for their earlier silence and to congratulate her on her new position. The woman who had entered the evening as invisible help was now the center of positive attention, her expertise suddenly valued rather than questioned. But the most dramatic change was yet to come, and it would involve not just Elena's professional future, but the personal relationships and industry connections that would shape the rest of her life. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted so dramatically that it felt like an entirely different gathering. Where tension and cruelty had dominated just minutes before, now warmth and genuine celebration filled the space. Elena found herself surrounded by some of the most influential people in the music industry, all eager to congratulate her and apologize for their earlier silence. But even as she accepted their kind words and well wishes, her eyes kept drifting to the corner where Bryce Wellington sat alone, his face a mask of barely controlled fury and humiliation. George Strait, however, wasn't finished addressing the elephant in the room. He had spent decades building a reputation based on integrity and respect, values that extended far beyond his music into every business relationship he maintained. What Bryce had done tonight wasn't just cruel. It was a direct violation of the principles that George held sacred, and there would be consequences that reached far beyond this dining room. "Bryce," George said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority, "I think we need to have a conversation." The celebratory chatter died down as everyone realized that the evening's drama wasn't quite over. "You see, I've been thinking about our business relationship while I watched you perform tonight, and I've come to some conclusions that I think you should hear." Bryce straightened in his chair, his businessman's instincts recognizing the shift in George's tone. For all his cruelty and arrogance, he wasn't stupid. He understood that his behavior tonight had consequences, and those consequences were about to be delivered by one of the most powerful men in country music. "George, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I was simply trying to protect your interests to make sure that—" "No misunderstanding at all," George interrupted smoothly. "I understand perfectly. You saw someone you perceived as powerless, and you decided to use that person for your entertainment. You took advantage of what you thought was a safe target to demonstrate your superiority and amuse yourself at another human being's expense." His words were delivered without anger, but with the kind of cold precision that was infinitely more devastating than any emotional outburst. The room had fallen completely silent again, but this time the quiet carried anticipation rather than discomfort. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, a moment that would be talked about in industry circles for years to come. George Strait was not known for public confrontations or dramatic displays, which made his methodical dismantling of Bryce Wellington all the more powerful. "The thing is, Bryce," George continued, "character matters in this business. Reputation matters, and I've built my career working with people who treat others with respect, regardless of their position or background." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the blow that everyone could see coming. "I don't think I can continue our professional relationship knowing what I know about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching." The implications of George's statement rippled through the dining room like an earthquake. Bryce Wellington's company had been involved in several of George's most successful projects, relationships worth millions of dollars that were now being terminated in front of witnesses who would ensure that the story spread throughout the industry by morning. But George wasn't finished dismantling Bryce's professional world. I've also been thinking about our upcoming collaboration on the soundtrack for that Western film, George said thoughtfully, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying a man's career. You know, the one that was supposed to launch next month. I'm afraid I'm going to have to withdraw from that project. I just don't feel comfortable having my name associated with someone who thinks cruelty is entertainment. Bryce's face had gone from pale to red, to a sickly grey as he realized the full scope of what was happening. The film soundtrack was supposed to be his biggest project of the year, a prestige piece that would have elevated his company's profile and opened doors to even larger opportunities. Without George Strait's involvement, the project would likely collapse entirely, taking with it not just millions in revenue, but also Bryce's reputation as someone who could deliver A-list talent. Furthermore, George said, warming to his theme, I'll be reaching out to some of my colleagues in the industry to let them know about tonight's performance. Not to spread gossip, you understand, but because I think people should know what kind of man they're considering for business partnerships. His smile was pleasant and completely terrifying. I believe in informed decision-making, don't you? Elena watched this exchange with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Part of her felt vindicated to see Bryce facing consequences for his cruelty, but another part of her, the part that had been raised to be compassionate even toward those who didn't deserve it, felt sorry for any human being experiencing such a complete professional destruction. But then she remembered his accusations, his attempts to paint her as a criminal and a fraud, and her sympathy evaporated like morning dew. George, please, Bryce said, his voice finally showing cracks in its earlier confidence. I think I may have gotten carried away tonight. The wine, the excitement of the celebration, surely you understand that people sometimes say things they don't mean when they're caught up in the moment. If I offended anyone, I sincerely apologize. Oh, you weren't caught up in any moment, George replied calmly. That was a calculated performance designed to humiliate someone you saw as beneath you. The only thing you're sorry about is that it backfired. He turned to address the room in general. I think we've all learned something valuable tonight about the difference between genuine character and the performance of character. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Maria Santos, one of the most respected producers in Latin music, smiling at her warmly. Eleanor, I hope you don't mind me saying, but what George just told us about your background is incredible. I've been struggling to find someone who can help me navigate some international projects, someone who understands both the business and cultural aspects of global music marketing. Would you be interested in discussing some consulting opportunities? Before Elena could respond, another voice joined the conversation. I'd like to throw my hat in that ring too, said David Chen, a music executive known for his work with international artists. We've been looking for someone exactly like you for months. Someone with your linguistic skills and cultural understanding could revolutionize how we approach global markets. Elena found herself suddenly at the center of a very different kind of attention than she had experienced earlier in the evening. Instead of being mocked for her abilities, she was being courted for them. Instead of being seen as a threat or a curiosity, she was being recognized as a valuable professional whose expertise could benefit multiple organizations. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that she felt slightly dizzy trying to process it all. If I may, George interjected gently, Elena has just accepted a position with my organization, but I'm sure we can work out arrangements for some consulting projects that would benefit everyone involved. He smiled at Elena with something approaching paternal pride. After all, talent like Elena's shouldn't be limited to just one project or one company. The more people who can benefit from her expertise, the better. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself engaged in serious business discussions with people who had treated her as invisible just hours before. She exchanged contact information with producers, schedulers, and marketing executives who were eager to tap into her linguistic and cultural expertise. The woman who had entered the evening worrying about keeping a housekeeping job was ending it with multiple offers for positions that would utilize her education and experience. Meanwhile, Bryce Wellington sat increasingly isolated at his table, watching his professional network dissolve before his eyes. Other guests began to distance themselves from him, conversations dying when he approached, business cards being tucked away rather than exchanged. The cruel entertainment he had provided earlier was now being paid for with the currency of his own reputation and relationships. Elena, George said quietly, approaching her during a brief lull in the networking conversations, I want you to know that none of this happened because I felt sorry for you or because I wanted to make a dramatic gesture. Everything I said about your qualifications and character, that's all true. You've earned this opportunity through 3 years of exceptional work and integrity." Eleanor looked up at him with tears in her eyes, but these tears were different from any she had shed earlier in the evening. These were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of hope for a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. "Mr. Strait, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done tonight. You didn't just give me a job, you gave me back my dignity." "You never lost your dignity, Elena," George replied firmly. "Dignity isn't something that other people can take away from you. It's something you carry inside yourself, and you've had it all along. What I did was simply make sure other people could see what was already there." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many of them stopped to speak with Elena one more time, to confirm meeting times and follow up on the business discussions they had initiated. She found herself with a small stack of business cards and several concrete opportunities that would not only improve her financial situation, but also allow her to return to the kind of work she had trained for and loved. Bryce Wellington left early and alone, his exit largely unnoticed by the other guests who were too busy celebrating Elena's transformation to pay attention to his departure. But Elena noticed, and despite everything he had put her through, she felt a moment of sadness for how completely his evening had unraveled. It served as a powerful reminder that cruelty ultimately costs the person who delivers it more than the person who receives it. The last guests finally departed near midnight, leaving Elena alone with George Strait in his dining room, for the first time since she had been hired 3 years earlier. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with mutual respect and understanding, rather than the careful distance that had characterized their previous interactions. "Sophia is going to be so proud of you," George said suddenly, causing Elena to look up in surprise. "Your daughter, I mean. When she hears about tonight, about the opportunities you've created for both of you, she's going to understand that all your sacrifices were worth it." Elena smiled through her tears, amazed once again by how much this man knew about her life and her motivations. "How did you know about Sophia's dreams? About why this job meant so much to me?" George's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Eleanor, you've been taking calls in 3 different languages during your breaks for 3 years. You think I didn't notice that most of those calls were to universities and scholarship offices? You think I didn't figure out that someone was working very hard to create opportunities for someone else?" The realization that her efforts had been observed and understood, even when she thought she was being completely private, brought fresh tears to Elena's eyes. But these were the best tears of all. Tears of being truly seen, truly valued, and truly supported by someone who had the power to change her life and had chosen to use that power for good. The evening that had begun with such promise and descended into such humiliation was ending with a transformation that neither Elena nor anyone else in that room could have predicted, but the most incredible changes were still to come. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez stood in the wings of Madison Square Garden, her professional headset crackling with conversations in 4 different languages as she coordinated one of the most ambitious international tours in country music history. Gone was the simple black uniform of a housekeeper, replaced by an elegant business suit that reflected her new role as international tour coordinator for George Strait's Bridges Across Borders World Tour. But more than her clothing had changed, Eleanor carried herself with the confidence of someone whose talents were not only recognized, but essential to the success of a multi-million-dollar operation. "Eleanor, we have the Brazilian media requesting an interview in Portuguese," came the voice of Jake Morrison, George's tour manager, through her earpiece. "Can you handle the cultural briefing for George before he goes on?" "Of course," Eleanor replied smoothly, switching effortlessly into coordinator mode. "Tell them we'll be ready in 15 minutes. I'll prep George on the regional music influences they'll want to discuss and the cultural references that will resonate with the São Paulo audience." She paused, checking her tablet for the evening's schedule. "Also remind wardrobe that George wanted to wear the custom shirt with the Mexican embroidery tonight. It's a tribute to the mariachi musicians who influenced his new Spanish songs." As she made her way toward George's dressing room, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The night of the dinner party felt like a lifetime ago, though the lessons learned during those painful hours continued to shape every decision she made. She had discovered that her greatest vulnerabilities, her linguistic abilities, her international experience, her immigrant perspective, were actually her most valuable professional assets when placed in the right environment with people who valued excellence over prejudice. The door to George's dressing room bore a simple sign that read, "Mr. Strait," but Elena knocked anyway, a habit that had developed naturally from their years of mutual respect. "Come in, Elena," came George's familiar voice from inside. She entered to find him reviewing the set list for the evening, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he made notes about which songs to perform in Spanish and which cultural explanations to offer between numbers. "Ready for the Portuguese interview?" Elena asked, settling into the chair across from his makeup station. Over the months, these pre-show briefings had become one of her favorite parts of the job, not just because they utilized her expertise, but because they had developed into genuine collaborative discussions about music, culture, and the power of authentic communication across language barriers. As ready as a Texas boy can be to discuss samba rhythms and bossa nova influences, George replied, with the self-deprecating humor that had endeared him to international audiences. "But seriously, Elena, I still can't believe how much my understanding of music has expanded since we started working together. These interviews don't feel like obstacles anymore. They feel like opportunities to connect with people who love music as much as we do." Elena smiled, remembering the early days of their collaboration when George had been genuinely nervous about international media appearances. His transformation from cautious country star to confident global ambassador had been remarkable to witness. "Tonight's audience is particularly special," she said, pulling up her cultural notes on her tablet. "Brazil has a massive country music scene that most Americans don't know about. They call it música sertaneja, and it shares a lot of DNA with American country. Stories about love, loss, hard work, and family values. When you mention that connection, you're going to see the entire arena light up." George nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the information with the same attention to detail that had made him a perfectionist in the recording studio. "What about the song dedications? I want to make sure I get the pronunciations right, especially for Corazón de Oro." "Perfect," Elena said, launching into the pronunciation guide they had practiced dozens of times. But beyond the technical aspects of language coaching, she found herself marveling at George's genuine desire to honor the cultures he was performing for. Many international artists simply translated their existing material and called it a day. George insisted on understanding the cultural context, the historical significance, and the emotional resonance of every song he performed in another language. A soft knock interrupted their session, and Sofia Vasquez peered around the door with the confident smile of a young woman who had grown comfortable in professional environments that once seemed impossibly out of reach. At 19, Sofia was in her second year at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, her tuition fully covered by the scholarship fund that George had quietly established after learning about her academic achievements. But more than financial support, Sofia had gained something invaluable: the knowledge that her mother's sacrifices had led to opportunities that benefited multiple generations. "Mum, sorry to interrupt," Sofia said in the fluent English that had made her a natural fit for her international relations program, "but the venue coordinator wanted me to let you know that the simultaneous translation equipment has been tested and approved for tonight's Q&A session. Also, the Spanish-language radio stations are reporting record call-in numbers for tomorrow's interviews." Elena felt the familiar swell of pride as she watched her daughter navigate the professional environment with natural ease. Sofia had been interning with the tour's media relations team during her summer break, and her combination of linguistic skills and cultural sensitivity had made her an invaluable asset to the operation. The dreams that Elena had harbored during those long nights of cleaning floors and serving dinner parties were now reality, but in ways far more extraordinary than she had ever dared to imagine. "Thank you, sweetheart," Elena replied. "Can you ask David to confirm the timing for the post-show reception with the local music industry representatives? I want to make sure George has time to really connect with the Brazilian songwriters who requested meetings." As Sofia departed to handle the logistics with the efficiency that had impressed everyone on the tour staff, George looked at Elena with an expression of deep satisfaction. "You know what the best part of this whole tour has been?" he asked. "It's not the sold-out arenas or the international press coverage. It's watching you and Sofia work together, seeing how your family's story continues to unfold in ways that inspire everyone around you. Elena felt tears threatening to spill, the good kind of tears that had become a regular occurrence since her life had transformed so dramatically. George, I need you to know that none of this feels real sometimes. 6 months ago, I was afraid to speak up in my own defense. Now I'm coordinating international media relations for one of the biggest tours in music history. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe it's actually happening. It's happening because you made it happen, George replied firmly. I may have provided the opportunity, but everything else, the expertise, the professionalism, the cultural insights that have made this tour so successful, that all came from you. You've earned every bit of recognition and success you've achieved. The conversation was interrupted by Elena's headset crackling to life with an urgent message from the venue's technical director. Elena, we have a situation. The local opening act's interpreter didn't show up, and they're completely lost trying to communicate with our sound engineers. Can you help us out? On my way, Elena responded immediately, already rising from her chair. This was exactly the kind of crisis that would have derailed international performances in the past, but had become routine problem-solving for Elena's team. As she headed toward the door, George called out to her, Elena, before you go handle that, I have something I wanted to discuss with you. His tone carried a note of excitement that made her pause. I've been talking with some people in Nashville about a new venture. There's interest in creating an international cultural exchange program for musicians, bringing American country artists to perform in other countries while also bringing international artists to Nashville to collaborate and learn. It would require someone to run it who understands both the music business and international cultural dynamics. Elena's eyes widened as she began to understand the implications of what George was suggesting. Are you saying? I'm saying that this tour has been so successful, so transformative for everyone involved, that people want to expand the concept. They want to create something permanent, something that could change how the music industry approaches global collaboration. George's smile was radiant. And there's only one person I can think of who has the skills and experience to make something like that work. The opportunity he was describing represented everything Elena had dreamed of during her years as an international interpreter. The chance to build bridges between cultures, to facilitate understanding through the universal language of music, and to create opportunities for artists who might otherwise never have the chance to share their talents with global audiences. The position would be based in Nashville, George continued, but would involve travel to music festivals and cultural events around the world. It would mean working with artists from every genre and every continent, helping them find ways to connect with audiences they never thought they could reach. He paused, his expression growing serious. It would also mean leaving the tour when this leg finishes, stepping away from the day-to-day coordination work to build something entirely new. Elena felt her heart racing as she processed the magnitude of what he was offering. But before she could respond, her headset crackled again with increasing urgency from the technical team. I have to handle this crisis first, she said with a laugh that contained equal parts excitement and professional responsibility. But George, if you're serious about this opportunity, then yes, absolutely yes, let's talk details after the show. As Elena hurried toward the stage area to resolve the translation crisis, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once been humiliated for speaking multiple languages was now being offered the chance to build an international program specifically designed to celebrate and utilize linguistic and cultural diversity. The skills that Bryce Wellington had mocked as pretentious were now the foundation for a career opportunity that could impact the music industry for generations. The irony wasn't lost on her that Bryce Wellington's company had filed for bankruptcy just 3 months after the dinner party incident. His reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed by the stories that circulated through industry networks that major artists and executives had systematically distanced themselves from his projects. Elena had heard through industry contacts that he was now working for a small regional music company, his influence and arrogance replaced by the kind of humility that should have guided his behavior years earlier. But Elena took no pleasure in Bryce's downfall. Instead, his story served as a powerful reminder that character and integrity were not just moral choices, they were practical necessities in a business built on relationships and reputation. The contrast between his trajectory and her own highlighted the difference between success built on tearing others down and success built on lifting others up. As Elena reached the stage area and began rapidly translating between the confused opening act and the American sound engineers, she felt the familiar satisfaction of using her skills to solve problems and create connections. Within minutes, the crisis was resolved. The Brazilian musicians were comfortable with their sound setup, and the evening's performance could proceed without delay. Standing in the wings as the opening act took the stage to thunderous applause, Elena watched George Strait prepare for his entrance with the calm confidence of a master performer who had found new purpose in his craft. The man who had once been content to perform exclusively for American country audiences was now eagerly anticipating the chance to connect with fans who would sing along to his songs in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. As George took the stage and launched into his opening number, Elena smiled at the realization that this moment represented far more than a successful concert or even a successful tour. It represented the power of seeing people for who they truly are, rather than making assumptions based on their circumstances, the importance of using privilege and influence to lift others up, and the extraordinary things that can happen when talent is given the opportunity to flourish. The story that began with humiliation in a Texas mansion was ending with triumph on a global stage, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the simple act of treating every person with dignity and respect. And as Elena prepared to embark on her next adventure in international music collaboration, she carried with her the knowledge that her greatest success had come not from hiding who she was, but from finally having the courage and the support to be herself completely.